Hi, my name is Jessie Haley, and I am the editorial director for Cita Press. I'm going to be talking to you today about the role of curation in open access archives and big digital repositories, specifically talking about books. We're a press, that's what we do. And I'll be using Cita as a case study for sort of larger questions and implications about curation and what to do with all this stuff we have available to us. Cita is a feminist open access press. We focus on books written by women that are mostly from the public domain. We emphasize design in basically every aspect of what we do. I mentioned I'm the editorial director. My counterpart, Juliana Castro-Veron, is the founder of Cita, and she's the design director. And we pair these texts with new covers, each by a different illustrator, and new forewords from scholars and writers who further contextualize these for contemporary readers. We occupy sort of several realms. We sit at the intersection of them, starting with early feminist literature. We pull mostly from the public domain. As I mentioned, our oldest book is from the 1500s. We go all the way up to the current century. And we think about like having this really small, we have about 15 books, tightly curated collection that spans like different centuries, decades, countries. We publish in both Spanish and English, and we're working on making the catalog fully bilingual. Various genres, subject matters, aesthetic styles, experiences of the author. So even though it's a small collection, it's pretty eclectic, and we intend for it to get more so. We also live in the world of open source code, open source fonts, images, taking this playful approach to tools that belong to all of us. And then finally, Creative Commons scholarship and design. So all the new stuff I mentioned, the covers and the forewords, we publish under a share alike license. And we encourage people to take our books, share them, adapt them, make something new from it, and just sort of have fun with this stuff that can, I think, feel remote in a lot of ways. We emphasize collaboration and decentralization and just equitable access to knowledge and culture. When people think about curation, they can often think of sort of the opposite of those values, something kind of calculating and exclusionary and sort of cold strategic decision making. Strategy is definitely a part of how we approach curation, but it's in service of those aims I just talked about. So the word curation comes from Latin curare, take care of, treat medically, cure. I like thinking about it as like a nurturing thing. One thing I keep thinking of in the context of this is like a huge field with all these seeds and sprouts growing from it. And the curator, in this case, takes from the field, chooses, puts things together in a way that makes sense to them, and then grows and nurtures those sprouts into something full and healthy and something you can feed other people from. So it's like a community garden plot in the middle of this vast field of endless material, that the curator decides like how it can thrive and shares it with other people. There's lots of practical import to curation. So curation can increase accessibility to things. It can help things that you want to get attention, and maybe stop the accidental algorithmic elevation of things that are harmful. You can also stop things from getting lost. Preservation is a huge part of it. And then in general, discoverability. So it's like being a librarian in the vast world of a digital archive is sort of helping people find what they look for in a very nuts and bolts sense, but also illuminating things that people didn't know they were looking for, but that they can draw some benefit from. When we talk about curation of online open access archives and specifically books, there's so much already there. So many big projects are focused on volume, and it's so much work for so many people to get this stuff off the page and into the ether. And that is a great starting point. Project Gutenberg has over 60,000 books digitized and proofread and available in multiple formats. Despite this vastness and volume, though, you can kind of see like the same things rise to the top that you already knew about. And with what people do with that, that's why you see like the same stories getting recycled over and over again. And there's nothing really wrong with that. There's a reason why those characters and ideas resonate across time. But it's interesting that in such a big world, it can still feel kind of like a small one. And that's where Cita comes in. Our starting intervention is just focusing on books by women, which itself is an incredibly vast field, much bigger than I think most people realize or assume. And from there, we focus on feminist books, which is also a pretty loose category that has a much deeper, longer history than it might seem. So visibility is where we start. There are currently only 11 books in the top 50 books listed under public domain on Goodreads, and 5 of those are by Jane Austen. Jane Austen is amazing, obviously, but many more women were contributing to culture and shaping the way we think and argue and imagine things. And so this isn't a complete story of what's out there and what has been out there. And it's not a very complicated one. So that's why Juliana founded Cita, and that's tackling this disconnect is really where we start. Just to give you another example, on Project Gutenberg's Top 100, there's only 17 books by women as of very recently. And again, many of them are by Jane Austen. So we want to tell a fuller, more complicated story about the history of feminist literature. Cita is a Spanish word that means date or appointment. It's also the feminine diminutive suffix. So mujer means woman and mujercita means little woman. And what we're doing with the name Cita is we're like kind of ironically signaling this relative smallness of the space that feminist literature from the past occupies in public consciousness, but we're also like claiming that smallness as a strength and that opportunity to curate, to weave together these different things to tell the story we're trying to tell. And as I said, our catalog's very small. Here are some examples from it. You might recognize a couple of these titles as ones you read in school. They're getting more and more popular, but all these books have a similar narrative of they were written, they were published, often against odds, often the first to do something. They made some kind of impact, often a big one, not always like, positively received upon publication. And then they sort of faded away, were forgotten, were dismissed, ignored, and then someone has resuscitated them recently, relatively. Most of this started in the 70s, and then we're kind of building on this curatorial work that people have already done to start to establish this narrative and doing our own interpretation to bring it to more people and people outside academic and other spaces where it tends to sit. To start to dig into examples, this is one of our books. It's a poetry collection called Men, Women, and Ghosts by Amy Lowell. And on the left, you'll see the original book as it appeared in 1916. And then you'll see 4 examples from the top results of Google image search of recent ebooks, I assume, maybe some print on demand, cheap print versions, which all of that is making things accessible, which is great. But you can see from the design of these covers that part of curation, that is interpretation, that is presentation, is being done in kind of like a template way. There might be some information you can get from these images, like mostly saying this book is old, we've got some old-timey handwriting, we've got some gold gilded things, or we got AI to pull out some words from the text and generate this creepy little girl illustration. And it doesn't really have much to do with the tone or anything going on in the actual poems included, which the poems are by this woman, Amy Lowell. She was super famous at the time that this book was published. She was known for having these big, super theatrical poetry readings that hundreds of people would come to. And she was a huge promoter, not just of her own work, but other poets. She thought that poetry should be like a mainstay of American culture, that everyone should participate in going to readings and checking out new work. And she was pretty successful at getting people interested. T.S. Eliot very derisively called her a demon saleswoman. I would imagine she took that as a compliment because she was pretty good at it. She was also a little subversive. So the scholar Lillian Faderman once said she wrote, quote, the most remarkable, barely encoded lesbian poems since Sappho. You can't really get that from those images we just looked at. Here is our image. It's by Anika Lapaho, who's a Finnish illustrator, and it's referencing mainly one specific poem called Patterns from the collection, which is very famous and is widely read as an anti-war poem, but it's also read as a critique of heteronormativity. And it relies on these really vivid, sensuous images and yeah, just kind of very much activates your imagination in this way that feels both strange and familiar. And I think that this image really makes that visible, literally, sort of takes a contemporary sensibility, applies it to the poem, but in a way that's in direct conversation with the words. So if you're a reader and you've never heard of Amy Lowell, you're invited into this text in a much different way than you are from those other images we looked at. This is Saint Teresa of Avila, also known as Saint Teresa of Jesus. We published one of her books, Meditations on the Song of Songs, which is our oldest book. It's from like roughly 1560s, I think. And it was a very dangerous text for her to write. It almost didn't make it out of the Inquisition, nor did she. Her confessor ordered her to burn all copies, and luckily she didn't, so we can still read it today. But this is the kind of stuff that comes up if you look it up immediately. And it is a religious text. It is written by a nun, a Spanish nun in the 16th century. It can feel very remote, and some of the super innovative things it was doing are not very visible. Teresa knew she was doing something dangerous when she wrote this book, and she basically has a disclaimer at the top of it. And yet she felt really strongly that it deserved to exist and that she had something to say. And that alone makes it feel like a very explicitly feminist text. But inside, it's engaging with the divine feminine. It's encouraging the other nuns she wrote it for to have their own personal spirituality. And it's got a like mystical veneer. I think Catalina Vesquez, the Colombian illustrator who did this image for us, really gets to that. She's speaking to a secular contemporary reader and like in telling them something about this text visually that not only contextualizes its boldness, but really mimics the style of the words to the extent that images can, in a way that really captivates me. This is one of my favorites, although it's hard to choose favorites. This is a quote. I'll hide myself so you can see it. This is a quote from the text that sort of points to this idea of like, I have something to say and I'm going to utter it. No one can stop me. And I sort of see the role of the curator as the person who takes that utterance, is entrusted with it by themselves or someone else, who knows, and furthers that work that the original author was doing in some way. For the last example, I'm going to talk about our next book, which comes out at the end of October 2023, pretty soon. It is a collection of fiction and nonfiction by Sui Sin Far, pictured here. That's the pen name of Edith Maud Eaton. She's the author of story collection Mrs. Spring Fragrance, which you can see here. We're not publishing the whole collection. Instead, we are publishing selections from that, other fiction that she published in journals and wasn't collected here, as well as some of her autobiographical essays and nonfiction. She was incredibly prolific. She wrote like almost, that we know of, almost 300 works of journalism, nonfiction and fiction that were published in journals read all across Canada and the United States. Her work appeared alongside Walt Whitman and Edith Wharton and Willa Cather in the same publications. She was quite prolific and quite successful. She's remembered for being an early Asian North American writer, her contributions to Asian Canadian, Asian American literary history, and for writing about Chinese characters from a point of view of realism and from a sympathetic point of view during a time where that was very much not the norm. So, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. It remained in effect until the 40s and really kind of beyond. And that banned all immigration from Chinese people to the United States. Didn't allow Chinese people who were in the United States to become citizens. And in general, it was a time of like intensely racist rhetoric in the media, in public, from politicians. And her work did not shy away from that, engaged with it directly, but it was very much focused on the everyday lives of her characters and how things impacted them, like they were real living people, you know? So she's known for who she was and what she wrote about. Um, that said, it can often be presented as very surface level, like her reputation and her body of work, and that started from when at the like her earliest supporters. This image in the middle is from a journal called Land of Sunshine that she published in a lot early in her career, and the editor was a good friend and supporter of hers, but he's talking about her to his readers like she's our little Chinese contributor and she's a delicate little flower, and you know, her work might not be the most sophisticated, but it has heart, and literature, like a woman, has to have a heart, right? And even like the first scholar to write about her decades later, I don't want to diminish his contributions, but he talked about her like, you know, what she wrote was not important. It's just the fact that she wrote it. And I don't agree. I think her work was incredibly complicated and interesting. I think her voice was really distinctive. Like now that I've read so much of it in choosing what to put in this text, I can instantly recognize her sentence structure and everything. She had a really complicated, shockingly contemporary way of thinking through questions of identity and race and sexuality, gender, disability, and not all of it is on the surface, but it's not too far below the surface, and I'm not sure her own audience always got what she was saying, particularly her humor, which could be quite scathing. So we wanted to put together a collection that someone who'd never heard of her could pick up, dig into, and kind of immediately find access to why it matters to them now. So this is the cover of our book. It's called An Immortal Book. That's a quote from one of her stories. And the design is by Shuhua Wang, and it really does a lot to both, you know, pull concrete images from the text, like with the tires. I don't want to spoil it, but and then just like the ideas and feeling and sort of luminous boldness of the text, it brings that right to the surface, and it's, I think, immediately intriguing and striking. And if I'd never heard of her, I would want to know what's in store for me. Similarly, the foreword by Victoria Namkun, who, like Sui Sin Far, is a journalist and a fiction writer, goes through both her fascinating biography and her you know, concerns and ambitions, and connects them directly to what's happening today in a way that I think she would, you know, really appreciate and resonate with. So I'm just going to end with a quote from one of her essays from the book, which I think gets to the heart of what we've been talking about in terms of like what curation can do, and specifically how we think about it in the context of these huge repositories with so much inside them, and how we can pull from them and make something small but meaningful. So it is only natural that one's heart should glow to know that one's work, though insignificant in itself, is being recognized for what it is worth or what it may lead to. Thank you for joining us for this, and thank you to Creative Commons for bringing us all together virtually. I hope the summit has been great, and I hope you'll stay in touch. You can find all of our books at citapress.org. You can find us on like half a dozen social media platforms right now. And you can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter, which contains a lot more where this came from in terms of like what we're thinking about, what we're pulling from, backstory behind our books, authors that we don't publish, but we, you know, pull together in surprising ways around a theme. Like September was labor history and feminist literature, for example. So, yeah, please stay in touch. Please reach out with feedback and questions, and hope to connect again online or off.